afternoon or good morning. I think it's technically still morning. If you're signing on, we would love to have you put in the chat who you are, what class you're from, where you're calling us, where you're joining us from. And also last week, we learned about competencies. If you want to throw in the chat, which of the competencies, collaborative competencies, did you feel most capable with? And as some of you may have done your self-assessment in the guide that you received in your email. We would love to have you share that as well. And please make sure you select all panelists and attendees so that your fellow attendees can see who's on here together. Good morning, Amanda, or good afternoon. It looks like we've got a few more people signing on, so we'll give it a minute. All righty. I'm going to go through a few announcements and then I will introduce you to our speaker today. If we have not met, my name is Hannah Pausch. I'm the program director with Ag Forestry. We are delighted that you're here with us. We are in week 3 of our collaboration series. And as you can see on the screen, we have centered our 2021 webinars around our mission and the 4 core competencies of communicate, collaborate, inspire, and serve. And so if you missed our communication series, we have all of the recordings up on our website, agforestry.org. Same with the last few weeks of this series, all of the recordings are on our website. And in June, we are going to dive into storytelling and how we share our stories and the stories of our industries out into the world. And you can register and learn more about all of those on agforestry.org/webinars. For those of you out there who are interested in golfing with us, we are excited. This year, our golf tournament is actually going to be 2 tournaments. So we have one on the west side and one on the east side. Again, all of that information is on our website. We would love to see you out there with us. And last but not least, this is an exciting announcement. We are making some changes to the way that we plan our seminars, and we are looking for your help. We are looking for folks in the industry and in our Ag Forestry network to help us plan our seminars. So this is an opportunity to help us develop the agenda, share your expertise so you have the opportunity to attend the seminar and interact with our classes, and then help us evaluate the experience and continually improve our seminars and our program. If you are interested in helping out with any of the seminars, please visit our website and sign up today so we can get in touch with you. I would love to have robust seminar teams as we start planning for class 43 to begin this fall, and class 42 will be resuming their experience this fall as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Amanda Murphy. Amanda has been with the Ruckelshaus Center since 2010. She's a senior facilitator for projects and programs. So she helped develop and she leads the training program as well as the internship program at the Ruckelshaus Center. And she comes with a great story and extensive experience working with collaborative teams and across a diverse set of, I'm losing my words right now, but different types of issues and industries. And so we are very excited. Amanda is going to walk us through situation assessments today. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Amanda.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, so much. Thank you all for this opportunity to be here, to get to talk with you all and share a little bit about situation assessments. So I am going to share my screen here. So give me one moment as I get this situated. Let's see. Okay. Are folks able to see the slides? Anybody in the chat, or Hannah, just want to let me know, is that coming through?
Yeah, Amanda, we're still seeing your presenter's view. We're not seeing the
Let's see, how about this one?
Perfect.
That work? Ah,
Yep.
perfect. Thank you. Trying to orient between the different screens. So great. Glad that worked. So thanks again, Hannah. So as you said, my name's Amanda Murphy. I'm our Senior Facilitator for projects and programs at the Ruckelshaus Center. Been with the center for almost 11 years. Also with Washington State University, I am faculty. You see here on the screen, assistant professor. I will come July 1st be associate professor. So really excited about that. So what I am going to do, I'm going to walk through a framework for conducting situation assessments. I believe, I think it was the first webinar that Michael Kern shared a bit of a framework for collaborative decision making and kind of that first stage of situation assessment. So we're going to be focusing there. Before I jump into the material, I just want to see if we can do in the chat. I just want to hear from folks, some of you, if you can just write here in the chat, what's one thing that you hope to have explored or learned or potentially better understand by the end of our time together today? Just getting the chat up, not seeing anything yet. Anybody? This just gives us an understanding, and me a little bit of a understanding of if there's anything really key that you all want to make sure that we do focus on. I can build that into our time together today. Great, thanks, Paul. What situations are best suited for using this tool? How to lead a process? Great. Well, I will keep monitoring that chat and looking at it because our time together today. So what I'm going to be talking about and sharing. There we go. So as Hannah mentioned, as I mentioned, I do lead up our training program, do a number of trainings in collaborative governance. And so this segment on situation assessments, when we do it in training, it really can focus on to be almost half a day or a full day. So what you're going to see here in these slides, got a lot of information in these slides, and they are a bit content heavy. And I won't be going through all of them in detail, but what I have learned over doing some of these shorter style presentations on situation assessments, that providing these slides as almost like a workbook or a packet of like detailed notes so that you all can go back at a later time and reference to them. I've heard from people that's really helpful. So there's a lot of extra information in this slide deck that I will get out to Hannah so she can get it out to all of you. That can really serve as a resource for any time you want to go back to that material. Just know that there is some extra stuff in here that we won't be focusing on too heavy today, but I've provided a lot of detail there so you can go back and revisit to it. Okay. So session objectives, just going to briefly introduce the elements of a typical situation assessment. Going to look at one framework in which we use a lot at the Ruckelshaus Center. And then together, we're just going to look at, explore, and discuss a little bit about just why the value of situation assessments, why those of us in collaborative governance as practitioners, why we conduct these assessments and the value they have in really informing and helping us design collaborative processes that really have the most potential to be successful. So this visual hopefully is familiar. I did have a chance to watch Michael Kern's first webinar with you all. So I do know that he presented this framework. So again, as he mentioned, these stages, while the visual looks linear here, they are not, this process isn't always linear, but we do like to start right here in the beginning, right? The situation assessment. So this is what we're going to focus our time today on. So when we talk about situation assessments, really the objective, why we do those, is to develop a better understanding of the situation of the issues. Who's affected or impacted or potentially impacted by those issues? Are there any potential solutions or opportunities to address those issues? What are the various needs and interests? Who's involved? So this is really the first step in us having a better understanding of what are the overall dynamics when we're talking about a situation and whether or not it is truly ripe for collaboration. So when I think of situation assessments, I really think that there are kind of four key areas in which we're looking at. Situation dynamics, right? What are the social, economic, environmental, political, various aspects around an issue? The second we're looking at is who is the involved as well as who's the underrepresented parties around an issue. So we're looking at what are the various individuals, groups, organizations, agencies, governments that may be impacted, who are involved or impacted, who could affect the situation, as well as looking at if a situation, if an issue were to be addressed and some kind of solution would happen, who might be impacted by that, as well as really looking at what are those underrepresented populations and parties within the issue around that situation. The third we're looking at is just what are the issues, right? Why are they important to people? What are getting past the people's positions, but what are the various interests? What do people believe should be done and why? What options might be helpful? Really looking at as well kind of a appreciative inquiry approach. So what are the various opportunities that might exist or creative ways to address an issue? And kind of culminating with what is the process or processes that might really help to address this issue, as well as what are the processes that might have been used already to date that have not worked. So those four kind of key areas we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is walk through one framework that we like to use when thinking about situation assessments. This is a framework that a colleague of mine, Chris Page, we put together and published on. And so there's a lot of steps and a lot of detail to it. So I won't be going into all of it in true detail, but I'm going to focus on a couple of key areas. So this is what that framework looks like. So we look at, there's really kind of these five stages and then some steps involved that we usually do. So this framework is also when we do more of like a formal situation assessment. And so that situation assessment is when, we have parties come to us and say, we have this issue, we're really interested in a collaborative process. Can we use a collaborative process to address it? So that's kind of the framework I'm going to walk through mostly today. However, we often get involved in work in which perhaps a group has already been created. So for example, we do a lot of work, legislature might create a task force or an advisory body. So the members are already identified and they say, Ruckelshaus Center, can you come and help facilitate that group? So even when we have a group that's already been convened and the membership set, we will still do a type of assessment where we talk with everybody who is going to be at the table before that first meeting and better understand what do they see as the issues, where are their opportunities, what do they see as purpose and scope. So I have provided in these slides some examples of some of like the questions we ask for those type of processes. So that information is available, but I won't spend too much time on that. I'm really going to kind of focus more on this framework. So we're going to start with the first stage. So stage one, this is really about kind of the planning and preparation, right? Everything you do in the beginning when you're really looking at, okay, so we have an issue here. Is it appropriate? Is it right for a collaborative process? So what we look at clarifying purpose and scope. And involved in that, what I'm going to focus a little more on is what we refer to, we do kind of a pre-assessment we refer to them as kind of the project sponsors. So those that come to us and say, we're really interested in doing a collaborative process, we have some key questions we'd like to ask right up front. From there, we do a little background research, and then we really start the process of developing those interview questions. So I'm going to really quickly share some examples of what that looks like. So clarifying purpose and scope. I have provided some questions here. These are some of the things that we are looking at right off the bat, whether or not we even do a situation assessment. So we like to ask just, why do you want to pursue a collaborative approach for addressing this issue? That is really important. We look at, what do you hope to accomplish? What's your objectives? What do you think other parties' objectives might be? We do have situations where people may come to us and say, we really want to have a collaborative process, but once we go out and talk to some other parties, they're not interested in having that collaborative process. That's a good thing to know. So we really like to explore, where is the energy? Especially because these type of processes, I think, as you all know, collaborative processes, they really require a lot of time, talent, and treasures. We want to make sure that before we even start the process of even assessing, having a better idea and indication of, is there even an appetite for even starting to explore whether or not a collaborative process is the right approach. We also like to ask those that come to us that maybe want to initiate a collaborative process, want to sponsor it, are you able to participate effectively? As I mentioned, these processes take time, talent, and treasure. So getting a better understanding of whether or not those that are wanting to initiate, do they have the capacity or the interest to actually really be involved in that process for the long term? Do you have the necessary time, financial resources, as well as asking those questions of, if you're going to bring people together and they're going to work that hard to come up with some kind of shared solution, are you committed as a decision-making entity to actually carry forward that decision into implementation? And exploring that in that kind of initial pre-assessment gets us that better understanding. Again, not all processes are appropriate, or not all issues are appropriate for a collaborative process. So I think Michael might have showed a graphic that doesn't look quite like this, but it's really similar. This is a spectrum for public participation, but we like to use this with the parties we work at to say, not all issues really require a collaborative approach. It might be that what you're looking for is just to get input from participants. So there are better processes that can do that. At other times, it might be you just want to provide information outward. There are some better processes that can do that as well, and that make it clear to those that you are engaging with in any way what the expectation of their involvement is. So that's kind of what we're exploring right in the beginning. And so I'm going to give an example here when it comes to purpose and scope, and why having a really clear purpose and scope for the assessment that you're doing is critical. So I imagine many of you know salmon recovery on the Columbia, in the Columbia Basin is very complex. It is contentious. It's a lot of policy issues involved with it. So years ago, NOAA Fisheries came to us at the Ruckelshaus Center, as well as we kind of a sister institute we have, Oregon Consensus at Portland State University, and they were really interested in looking across the whole Columbia Basin. What do people, what should the processes for long-term salmon recovery look like? And so we worked really hard to have that scope, and I have it here for you, the purpose of the assessment, to allow for it to be broad enough so that it could be very inclusive of all the various parties that are engaging in salmon recovery, potentially impacted by those recovery efforts. So there's some key words here in this purpose and scope, right? To explore regional views. This assessment was about actually looking at exploring and gathering and getting a better understanding of what the region, all those views were. And then how best to approach long-term salmon recovery, right? So not today, but looking forward in the long term. And that was purposeful, keeping that scope, as you can see here, broad, just based on how contentious salmon recovery was at the time we were doing this assessment. It allowed us to really focus the conversations with individuals looking at the long term, so we weren't getting too caught up in what the current politics and a lot of the current lawsuits were happening at that time. That's just an example on purpose and scope. So I'm providing this framework here. This is one of my favorite frameworks. And so kind of next step in the work we do is kind of doing a little bit of background research, just trying to better understand about the situation in which we're going to be assessing. This model right here, it's a systems thinking model, and it comes from the Waters Foundation. They do a lot of really great work on systems thinking, but I just love this framework. So they talk about when you're looking at a system, trying to get kind of below the surface to better understand what the various dynamics within a system. And so you kind of see at the top of this iceberg here events, right? So understanding what's happening currently, but beginning to better understand what has been happening. So what's the history around those issues? What are the things that have led to what is happening today? Then beginning to do a little bit of research and better understand kind of the structures within the system. So what are the institutions, the laws, the policies, the things that have been created that have led to what is happening today. So kind of working up. And then right at the bottom here, the mental models, right? That's why conducting assessments, we go out and we talk to people. We have conversations and interviews. We really want to better understand what are people's assumptions, beliefs, the values they hold around those issues. So I like to always just kind of put this up, it's up on my wall, and just a reminder to always try to get below the surface when looking at an issue. So here's another just kind of a visual for what conducting some background research might look like. So this also comes from that salmon recovery assessment we did. And so you can see we kind of laid out, we really wanted to understand kind of what are the various salmon recovery efforts. And this is just kind of a visual of some of those things that we were looking at to better understand. So interview questions. So right up in the beginning is where we really begin to develop those interview questions. So after we've narrowed and defined what the scope and the purpose of an assessment is, we then begin to draft those questions. So, really important to recognize there is no one size fits all way to do these assessments. Really, they need to be tailored to kind of the uniqueness of the situation. But we do start, and what I provided here on some slides are examples of kind of the framework questions we start with, and then use to begin to tailor based on the situation. And so those are here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I have a couple that I've highlighted that I do want to focus on. So you can see here, right in the beginning of those interviews that we do, the conversations we have with people, we like to start with big picture and vision. So starting more in that appreciative inquiry approach. And we often find that if you were to just ask one question, this is the question to ask. Often the bulk of really important information comes from just engaging people in this question. Often we focus a lot on what's not working well and why, but beginning to shift the mindset right in the beginning of the interview to focus instead on what success looks like, that just is usually really impactful for the conversation. So we use a question kind of like this. If you imagine it's whatever time frame in the future, and efforts to address this issue have been successful, how would you know? What does that look like? What do you see happening and not happening? Another way to ask that question is, imagine you woke up tomorrow and this issue was solved. What would be the first thing you would see, witness, experience that would make you say, oh my gosh, we've addressed this issue? And from there, we then have the questions are really tailored to follow from the responses of what does success look like, right? So what are the challenges or barriers to getting to this future you want to see? How to address those challenges and barriers. Another question we always make sure to ask is what you see here on number 7. What do you think will happen if status quo continues? At times, as you're identifying who is impacted or likely impacted by a situation, it's not uncommon that you do have parties that the status quo works. And it's good to know that in the beginning, because that is one of the things we're assessing of whether or not a situation is right. If you have key parties that for them, what is currently happening is what's working, status quo is what is successful. There's a lot of different work that you're going to, a collaborative process might not be ripe at that time, or there's no incentive for those parties to come together to work out a solution if what's happening to date is working. So it's really good to assess that right up front in the beginning, as well as asking, are you aware or participated in any efforts or things that have worked before that we could use as a model? So again, trying to identify, what's already happening, but are there other things that we could, lessons learned from other processes that could be applied to address this situation? Then again, I'm just providing these questions so you have them as a resource, but that last question is really critical too. Who else do you think is going to be important to interview or talk to, and why? And we use those responses to help continue to build out our interview list. Another question I like to ask, it's not on this slide, but it's, what should I have asked that I didn't ask you today? Again, trying to understand, was there, based on our questions, anything, additional that you want to add? And found that that's a really great question as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about why number 12, asking that question is important to us doing these assessments, because it helps us build out that interview list that we create. So I had mentioned just a little bit ago that I provided an example of questions for when you already have a group that has been established and you're doing kind of the assessment before you're convening that group for the first time. So I provided some questions here. The example comes from the Washington Coast Advisory Council that we convened years and years ago. So I'm not going to go through all these questions, but you can see I provided them here for you all as a resource. You'll get these slides after. If you're looking for just some kind of good questions or examples of questions to kind of get you thinking of what you might want to ask, again, if you already have a group that has been established. But you can see here, we're asking kind of similar, right? Do you understand or have a clear understanding of why you've been asked, to come to the table in this process? What are your goals, expected outcomes? How do you know if you would be successful? And the information that we gather from doing these type of assessments is we use that to really create what we call as kind of the first offer for ground rules for operating procedures. It really informs the meeting structure and how we tee up topics and conversations, from the first meeting on. So this type of information is really critical, again, to design the process. I'm gonna, as I mentioned, here's a couple more. So stage 2, that's where we're kind of looking at and identifying interview participants. So I'm not going to spend too much time just in this stage, but I'm going to give just a couple examples that might be helpful. Just how do we go about identifying who are kind of key parties, unrepresented populations, as I mentioned before. Who do we talk to? So show a couple examples of how we just start doing that, as well as creating some interview criteria. We know that, for example, the Columbia Basin Salmon Recovery Assessment that we did, you can imagine we could have talked to thousands of people, right? I think we had created a list of about 800 people to talk to. We knew we weren't going to be able to do all that. So having some criteria to really bound who it is that we were going to speak to is really critical to create right up front and in the beginning. And then developing that interview list, but allowing that list to be emergent. So when we get involved in an issue, we like to start with kind of high-level thinking in categories, right? So what are kind of the categories of participants that might be engaged in this issue? Are there local community representatives, government, business, churches, faith organizations, media organizations? Looking at, are there underrepresented populations, environmental, racial and social justice equity organizations? We kind of like to create these big categories first to start with and really try to think through what are all the various kind of groupings of parties. And I'm gonna just go through and go back to these. And so here's an example of what that looks like. I forget which project we created for this, But you can see we start with those big high-level categories, and then we begin to think about, so what are the various kind of organizations, associations, groups, individuals, or so on that might fit within those categories. So that's how we begin that. And then it's about doing a little bit of research, talking with people, even just internet and Googling to try to identify the actual people or who to call to say, we're really looking to get some diverse perspectives from those that are representing river and waterway associations in this area. Who should we talk to? So there's a little bit of that work just to try to build that list. And then I mentioned, there we go. So interview criteria. So here's an example of some of the questions that we are asking ourselves as we're building that list. Again, who may be impacted or affected by the issue, who are voiceless often or have not or been underrepresented in around this issue, who's contributing resources or funding around these issues, who's critical to have at the table for agreement, as well as who's critical to have at the table for implementation. So where does power and authority lie around this issue? So here's just a couple examples that we're asking ourselves when we're thinking and building a list. And then here's an example of criteria. As I mentioned, just for the scope of these efforts, it's impossible to talk with everyone. So instead, the goal really becomes if anybody were to look at the list of everybody that were talked to as part of the assessments, the goal is that people can say, well, you didn't talk to me, but you talked to so-and-so or so-and-so entity, and they really represent or can speak on behalf of my perspective. So while you didn't talk to me, you talked to so-and-so, and I feel confident that my concerns are reflected. So that's really the goal. So here's an example of some of the criteria we create to try to bound these assessments that we do. And Hannah, I think we'll do questions at the end, or would you like to? I can pause here and see if there's any questions, and before we go to the end. Anything either you prefer?
Yeah, we can do questions. I think typically if you guys have a clarification question at this time, go ahead and put that in the chat, and then that way we can handle it now. And then if it's bigger questions, then we'll save those for the end, if that's okay.
I'll just give a couple seconds and see if we have anybody that has any clarifying.
Perfect.
Well, Hannah, if anything comes up in the chat, I'm trying to also monitor it, but feel free, just interrupt me and I'll stop and respond if we have clarifying questions.
Perfect. I'll barge in if I need to. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Great. So the next stage of these assessments is when we conduct those interviews. Conversations, it depends on the formality of the assessment we're doing. But I will just kind of quickly talk a little bit about just the contacting people and scheduling, a few lessons we've learned there. And then interviewing, it is a skill set that I have found that you have to be everlastingly developing. It's a bit of a continual learning journey. So we do a little bit of training just on interviewing, and then there are a lot of great training kind of programs and classes and that on interviewing skills. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but just do want to acknowledge that that is a really core skill set, and it is one that we as practitioners in this field are continuously developing that skill set. But just a few kind of key things in the contacting and scheduling of people. When you are going to reach out and you do want to have a conversation and interview someone on, doing these assessments, being really clear, again, what is the purpose and what is the scope of what you're doing? So providing that right away, as well as we always send to people the questions in which we are going to be asking them in the interview. We send them to people in advance. we like to make sure that people have had an opportunity to, if they would like to sit with those questions, to reflect on them beforehand. So we make sure always those questions go out before. And sometimes we have people that say, I just don't have time to speak with you. However, thank you for sending me the questions. I've kind of provided some written responses. So that we do recognize that for some, providing feedback in a written format is much easier than a verbal. So we always give that opportunity. And we make sure that in that introductory email communication that we provide when we are asking people, we would love to have an interview with you, we make sure to make it clear what we're going to be doing with the information in which they're telling us. So this is where we provide information on confidentiality. We make sure people know that them speaking to us when we provide any kind of a final product. So our formal assessments, we have an assessment report we provide. We make sure that folks know that we are not going to be quoting anybody individually, that what we provide in those reports is an aggregation of what we heard and learned from people. So again, holding to that confidentiality. What we do let people know, though, is that we like to include a list of the names and affiliations of everybody that we did speak with as an appendix in that report. So we make it clear to people that we would like to do that. However, if people want to opt out of having their name put in that report, we'll honor that as well.
Great. Hey, Amanda, we've got a few questions in the chat. Is there a recommendation to condense the interview timeline to keep all responses within a specific time frame?
Yeah, I'm just looking. Can you read that one more time for me?
Yeah, because there's a few in there. So the first question is there a recommendation to condense the interview timeline to keep all responses within a specific time frame?
So I'm thinking condense the interview timeline. So I think it kind of depends on the type of the assessment in which you're doing and who you are talking with. So for the timeline of doing an assessment, it really depends on the kind of scope. And as I mentioned, just contacting and scheduling people. We often get approached by entities and we say, well, we're going to do an assessment, and they're like, great. So after a month, you'll have talked with 60 people and we'll be done. And we're like, takes a lot more time to be able to, get people on the phone and do that. So often we talk about the time really is tailored to the uniqueness of the situation. For when we're conducting interviews, I found that, again, it depends on how many questions you're asking, but usually an hour or a little bit more suffices. We have tried many a times to kind of shorten that time frame or just ask a few key questions, but we try to be adaptive. And this is an opportunity for the people we're talking to be able to have a one-on-one. And often it's the first opportunity they've had to be asked like a different type of question. And so we really try to, as best that we can, be a bit adaptive and emergent to whoever we're talking with. So we try to really hold to an hour, and we let people know that in that introductory email saying, we'd like to request an hour of your time, and, hold that to individuals. But again, being a little bit emergent, that if we do have individuals that want to provide more information, schedule a second, we look as a team, do we have the ability to do that? I think that got at the question.
And real quick before we move on, there was another question, kind of a two-part question. In your role as neutral facilitators, do you ever find that you need to remove someone from the group? Kind of how and why? And then the second part of that is, do you ever find that you need to persuade the sponsoring organization to include someone that they would rather not? And could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, so to the latter, absolutely. And that's the value of doing an assessment, right? So, when we are approached and by the sponsor, we do make it really clear that doing this assessment, that what we are going to explore is, are there missing voices or perspectives not addressed? And that we make it really clear for, at least for us in the work we do with sponsors, that the process, while it might be that they are sponsoring, creating a collaborative process, it is the buy-in and ownership of everybody around the table. So no one individual owns that process, but instead it's the collective of the group and the whole. And so we provide that recommendation to say, here are the entities you need that should be at the table. They are the key parties, and really working with those sponsors to recognize that just because if you were to leave somebody out of the conversation, actually you are likely to find that your ability to implement later on is going to be hindered. It's better to bring everybody together in the beginning than to leave parties out who are then have even more of an incentive to be, to speak out against whatever the outcome might be. So it is, we do work really hard with individuals, and it has to be the collective of a group to say, here we are and here is our membership. Do we ever find that we need to remove someone from the group? So that, again, once you get a group together, you establish those ground rules and how you're going to operate. And the decision for any individual to be removed from the group really has to be a decision made by the group. So, and I find with a group I'm working with right now, really, what's challenging as facilitators is making it really clear that like our role is to hold to the process. I think Michael Kern likes to use the analogy, at times, in a way we are in that kind of role as kind of referee, but we're not here to, but again, we're here to help hold accountable to process. Those type of big decisions really need to be made by the group as a whole because it is their collective. So if we do have individuals saying we need to remove so-and-so, we then work to bring that forward to the full group and have that be a group conversation. There's a lot of back end that happens behind the scenes in doing that. But again, we as facilitators do not make any kind of executive decisions for the group. It really is the group that has to buy in and make those decisions. And usually we lay out as a first offer in operating procedures, membership, roles, responsibilities of members, and how membership replacement might happen. So I'm not sure if Michael in one of his series gave examples of like operating procedures, but I'd be happy to provide anyone, an example of some of those that we use so you can see some of that language that we work with the group.
Perfect. We just have one more question. I think it'll be fairly quick and then we'll let you move on. Is social media used in this process in any way? And if yes, how?
Yeah. So again, it all really depends on the situation in which you're using. So I have trying to think of, at least during situation assessments at any time using social media, I think the only time we used it as a mechanism in which to, it was kind of like an assessment. So a few years ago, we were asked by our legislature to go out and better understand what do people desire for their future in Washington State, and then how can we better get to that desired future with our looking at our growth management planning framework. So are there changes, additions, revisions to that planning framework that would better help us get to that desired future? And so that's a pretty big scope. So we ended up doing workshops in 26 regions in the state. We did 2 in each one of those. So we used a little bit of social media in for some of those, especially we did a few workshops in Spanish. And so just trying to get out and communicate out that, hey, we're having this workshop. We really, we're looking for people to come and attend because, kind of like a focus group we were doing in a way, but it was really, we were just trying to get as many people we could to ask some questions. So that's really more how we've used social media. Otherwise, we often try not to, just because it is a platform in which it's really hard to manage in kind of a ground rules, operating procedures, and behavior. And as the Ruckelshaus Center, that goes outside of kind of our scope of what we do. Now, there are processes in which there is some type of a public engagement component needed. So we don't do that work. So public engagement is not kind of the wheelhouse of which we operate in, but we will kind of reach out or work with groups if that component is necessary. And then usually we have some other kind of group that really is skilled, and that's the work they do in kind of the public engagement round, and they will run that component of the project.
Awesome. Thank you for answering those questions. And that concludes the questions we have at this time.
Perfect. Well, so getting back to, we were talking about interviewing. So we're going to do an exercise right now. So what I'm going to ask you all to do, if you could grab a piece of paper, a pencil or pen, so any kind of writing utensil and something to write on. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read off a series of instructions, and you are going to draw what you hear me saying. There are just a couple of rules for this activity. You may not ask me. So in the chat, no asking me questions, no asking others questions. So, and nobody respond, if anybody does ask questions in that chat, no responding, right? So this is I am the only one kind of speaking, kind of a silent exercise. So again, I'm gonna read off a series of instructions and you are going to draw what you hear me saying. Again, no asking questions. If you have a piece of paper, pen, pencil in hand, I am going to begin. So first instruction, draw an egg shape. Okay. Draw a circle touching the egg shape. Draw a small circle inside the circle you have just drawn. Draw 3 straight lines inside the egg shape. Draw 2 small lines coming out of the circle that touch at one end. Repeat just below. And then draw 2 longer lines coming out of the egg shape. Draw a line to join up those 2 lines and draw 3 straight lines inside the shape you have just created. Draw 2 lines coming out of the bottom of the egg shape. Draw 2 short lines coming out of the lines you just drew. Great. So does everybody have their drawing? All right, is this what everybody drew? And I think we have a couple people that volunteered to share their drawings. So Hannah, are we able to get some folks up? We're seeing some drawings here.
There we go. Okay, we've got Carol, Amanda can turn on, and then Dave also said that he would be willing to share. So you'll just have to turn on your camera.
Did anybody draw a chicken? Almost. Yeah, we got somebody almost drew a chicken.
So Janelle said, I drew 2, one on top of the other. And Jordan Hansen says, not even close. Lindsay Williams, almost.
So in the chat, if you could, what made this task difficult? Not enough detail and instructions. Didn't know where we were going. Not being able to ask clarifying questions. No object, right? Nope. Not clear why. heard me say 8 instead of egg. Great. So I love this activity because, what it really highlights, and it's one of those key core skills when we talk about interviewing, when we're doing situation assessments, that this type of interviewing is not about just asking people questions and saying, thank you for your response, next question. Instead, the goal of having these conversations of interviewing is really that active listening to better understand and really tease out the responses in which you're hearing. So it's often why you keep hearing me kind of refer to this as a conversation, because what we're really trying to get to is better understanding not just where people are saying their positions are at, but the reasons for why. And so again, that active listening, really listening to understand, to gain that better understanding of what people are saying, because that is the information in which you're trying to pull out in order to better understand where are their opportunities, where are their challenges, why is this an important issue for individuals. So I highlight that and want to make really clear that the interviewing we're doing is not that research-based kind of traditional approach of just asking a question and moving on to the next. It is more of that semi-structured based interviewing, where it is having a series of questions that serve as a guide, but being able to ask follow-up questions, being able to ask people, wow, you brought up this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, or expand? Or let me make sure I'm understanding. You were saying X. Can you tell me a little bit more about why that's important? So think about these as that opportunity to have more of a conversation and not a traditional interviewing type approach. So I've provided just a couple of things to consider when interviewing. I'm not going to go through them, but again, I provided them here as a couple lessons learned if you want to go back and look at them. And I mentioned too about expanding the interview list. So we like to start out with, after we've kind of built out, here are all the kind of categories, the various kind of groups that might fit in with these categories. And here's, based on what we know so far, who might be the individuals that we're going to want to talk to. We then kind of pull back and say, if we were only able to talk with, let's say, 10 people, who might that be and why? And again, using that criteria to inform. And we kind of start there. And so we work these interviews kind of in concentric circles, and we make sure to ask everybody, who else should we talk to, right? You saw that question. We then go back to our original list and go, okay, did we identify that person? Do they fit within the criteria? Often you have people will bring up the same person over and over again. So that's a good indication that that individual somehow is, very involved in the issue or represents an important perspective. We also look at who's not getting mentioned and why. Again, that could be a really good indication of potentially an underrepresented population or people that have not been in the conversation to date. So we do make sure to be constantly expanding out that interview list. So we don't say, often we'll say, all right, we're scoped to talk with 50 people, but we don't identify all 50 of who that's going to be right up in the beginning. We first start with a kind of general list, start with kind of who we think would be the first kind of 10, and then we kind of work our way outward. So kind of that snowball sampling technique, I think is how it's referred to in interviewing methodology. So stage 4, this is really the analysis and then the design. There are a lot of different approaches to analysis, and it really varies and depends on the purpose and type of assessment you're doing, right? If you're doing assessment like I brought up the example of the Columbia River salmon versus doing an assessment with a group that's already formed, like our coastal group, how we analyze what we heard and learned from individuals is going to be a little bit unique. And when it comes to process design, we do a full day training on process design. So I'm not going to talk too much about it. I'm going to give just a kind of couple examples, but do know that that is kind of its own kind of robust area of skill set development that we work on. When it comes to analysis, so here's just another little activity I would love to do. So if you could in the chat, just really quickly, how many squares are there? So just some folks count, how many squares do you see? 21, 17, get a couple more. 2, none, 25, none, the rectangles, yes. 4, great. 16. I think I saw some 17s. I think I saw some 21s. Yeah, and there's some 30s, 29s, 27s. So it just kind of use this example as there are often just many possibilities and more than one way to address an issue. That when we're doing these assessments, we're really looking for the nuance and the many possibilities that might exist to address an issue. That when it comes to problem solving, that both how people perceive the issue and then based on those perceptions, there is almost always more than one way to satisfy interest. So again, we're trying to get below the surface of positions, understand better what people's needs are and why around that issue, and then really look at what are the possible many options in which to address that issue. So again, we're kind of right in this area. I circled it when it comes to kind of analysis and design. So now we have all our information. We're reading back through the things that we've heard and learned from the interviews that we've had, and we're really kind of looking at, so is this situation right for a collaborative process? If so, how we would design it? If not, what do we do? So I think Michael provided this visual. So again, these are just some of those conditions we're really looking out for when we're thinking about, is the situation ripe to initiate a collaborative process? Now, these are not all of the things we might be looking for, but we kind of start with this just to get a better understanding of, okay, so are those conditions favorable? Now, I'm not going to go into detail in this because I think Michael already talked a bit about those conditions. But if we say, you know what, we think conditions are favorable, we will begin designing the process. And in designing that process here, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into process design, but I've provided this is just a little tool and framework we like to use when we start process design. Kind of what's the purpose, who are the people involved, what are the protocols we need to develop. So we're going to develop first offer of operating procedures, ground rules, all of that provided at the first meeting and convening of a group to get buy-in, and they're going to recraft and shape and agree on those. There's some pre-work that might need to happen, like joint fact-finding, maybe some collaboration training. And we think a lot about what is the desired outcome or product of the process. If conditions are not favorable, we also document that and why, and we might recommend some next steps. So I provided this. This is just meant to be visual, not to read. But this came from the Columbia Salmon Recovery Assessment. So we identified a lot of different issues and laid out, so here are ones that maybe a collaborative process wasn't appropriate for yet, or just didn't need a collaborative process. So instead, maybe some joint fact finding. Sometimes legislative or judicial action is needed on an issue. At times, policy changes are needed in order for a group to come together and address an issue. So even if we determine that a collaborative process is not favorable at the time, we still do provide some recommendations on what other processes might be. For instance, maybe it's just a public engagement process. And then stage 5 is really about reporting findings. So again, depending on how formal that assessment is, it might be a full-scale report. If it's smaller, it just might be that you're providing like a one-page of key themes that were heard and providing that back out to the group at your first convening. Either way, we do like to stay at the level of aggregate key themes, not attributing names, not quoting people, and so on. So I provided here just a visual of what some of those reports look like. They are available on our website. So if you do want to ever take a look and get a better feel for the variety and diversity of the type of assessments we do, that is all available. You can find it here at ruckelshauscenter.wsu.edu, and feel free to email me at any time with questions, or if you want a copy of any of those reports, I'm happy to provide. So with that, real quick, lots of information, but I'll stop here and see if we have any more questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda. This has been so wonderful and informative. We are right at 1 o'clock, and I want to make sure I honor people's time. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. If it's all right, Amanda, I can email you the questions, and then that way, when we send out the recording, we can get any questions answered that we didn't have time to answer live. But if you are okay with it, we have a couple questions. Do you have a couple minutes? And then anyone who wants to stay on can stay on.
Absolutely, yeah. I am available. I can stay on.
Perfect. So the first question is just, could you share your thoughts on how to figure out the optimal size of a group? This person says, I like your thoughts on inclusivity, but is it possible for a group to be too large?
Yeah, that is a great question. And again, it really depends. There are those times in which too big of a group, it is really difficult to get anything done. Too small of a group, you might be missing really key voices and perspectives. So that's when it really comes to thinking about size of group really should be based on what is the desired outcome, as well as what is the level of effort needed to reach that desired outcome. So, often you could say, wow, we could have a group of like 50 people. But then it's to think about, is there a way of creating, for instance, one example, when I started at the center, we were facilitating an agricultural critical areas committee. And so lots of various people you could have at that table, right? So what the design of that process was to actually create caucuses. So you had an agricultural caucus, an environmental caucus, county caucus, tribal caucus. And so instead you kind of had a caucus made up of some key organizations that were meant to represent all of the other various entities and organizations within kind of environmental, right? So at times the design might be really about creating more of a caucus structure, as well as those that are at the table in the processes we make it really clear they are there to represent on behalf of some kind of a constituency. So it really is that individual holding that seat's responsibility to be reaching back out and bringing in those voices of the constituency they represent. So for instance, currently I'm facilitating our state's criminal sentencing task force. And so we have two individuals representing, for example, the interests of incarcerated individuals. So they are responsible, and they have a group in which they convene and are reaching out to bring that perspective in, save with those on that group that are representing the interests of survivors and victims. They have created, those groups. So that's another way to design it, as well as sometimes you have maybe advisory or like working groups. So we've had processes where you have a group and they are kind of the policy group, and then maybe you have like a technical committee that's doing like the technical work of people. So again, it really depends. I tend to find that right now the task force facilitating has 21 members, and then each member has an alternate. So I think when you get past 40, it is really difficult in any type of a way. So we do try to not have it be too big, but also the bigger the group, making sure that the group understands that means a little more time and attention is going to need to go into the process. So longer meetings, more creativity in how those meetings are structured to allow for more dialogue and before getting to deliberation, creating working groups and so on. So like I said, it just kind of depends. There's really no one size fits all. But if you are going to have a big group, getting creative on the design and how to structure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking time for that extra question and staying on. This has been wonderful. We thank you for your time. And I want to make sure that we close this out before we keep people too long from their next Zoom meeting. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank
Oh,
you. Thank you for the
and
opportunity and getting to share our work with you all. Really appreciate it.
all right. Thank you all for being, I can see a lot of you stayed on. So thanks so much for being with us today and staying on a few extra minutes. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.